Gulf War Syndrome. Today, around 250,000 veterans are still disabled by a mysterious disease known as Gulf War Syndrome, a medical anomaly with a distinctive set of symptoms that strangely only affect soldiers who served in the 1991 Persian Gulf War. For decades, the causes of this peculiar chronic illness baffled and divided scientists as they debated whether the malady had a psychological or biological explanation. And it's only recently, over 30 years after the end of the conflict, that some of them have claimed to have found the definitive answer. The Gulf War. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein ordered Iraqi troops to cross the border into neighboring Kuwait just 2 hours after the breakdown of peace negotiations, claiming that the Kuwaitis were illegally extracting oil from the Al Rumaylah oil fields that straddled both sides of the frontier. By August 8th, Hussein had formally annexed Kuwait and was referring to it as Iraqi's 19th province. In response, a 956,000-strong NATO peacekeeping mission dubbed Operation Desert Storm, composed of soldiers from the USA, the UK, France, the UAE, Egypt, and many other nations, was sent to the Middle East to liberate Kuwait from an Iraqi army that numbered around 650,000 personnel. On the morning of January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm commenced with a devastating U.S. airstrike targeting Iraqi air defenses, communication relays, weapon factories, and oil refineries. Following a 5-week campaign of aerial bombardment, NATO ground troops would finally make an appearance on February 24th for Operation Desert Saber, where they were ordered to make incursions into Kuwait and southern Iraq. It would prove a decisive intervention, for within the space of just 4 days, the Iraqis were expelled from Kuwait, while NATO forces penetrated the region of Iraq just south of the contested Al Rumaylah oil field, overcoming the last pocket of Iraqi resistance there a day before a ceasefire was announced on February 28th, where Saddam Hussein agreed to the respective sovereignty of Kuwait and to dispose all of his weapons of mass destruction. Gulf War Syndrome and Symptoms. Although the war had officially ended, for many Gulf War participants on both sides, it would mark the start of another, more personal battle. With the ink barely dried on the armistice documents, many veterans began to contract a diverse catalog of perplexing symptoms, ranging from cognitive issues like depression, forgetfulness, loss of focus, and insomnia, to physiological problems such as headaches, fatigue, back pain, as well as respiratory and gastrointestinal disorders. 6 months after the war came the release of the first documented cases of Gulf War Syndrome from the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Denmark. But it was only after the 1998 landmark passing of the Persian Gulf War Veterans Act by the US government that a serious evaluation of Gulf War Syndrome was undertaken, with researchers initially believing this multi-symptom sickness to be either the result of psychological trauma or a consequence of chemical overexposure. Explanations: psychological or biological. Psychological stressors. Among the first explanations offered for Gulf War Syndrome was that similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, suggesting it was a psychological disorder arising from the stresses of combat, with advocates pointing to the well-established fact that traumatic experience could cause a multitude of psychological and biological side effects. It's true that although the Gulf War was brief, it was just as violent as many other conflicts. A survey of thousands of combatants revealed that they were most distressed when witnessing the death or injury of an enemy soldier, being attacked by enemy fire, or seeing a comrade wounded or killed in front of their eyes. While many captured U.S. Marines have related how they were brutally tortured by Iraqis and were routinely electrocuted, beaten, and struck with canes, pieces of wood, and improvised whips. The psychological argument, however, has largely been dismantled by an avalanche of research, which indicates that even the most extreme combat-related psychological stressors were not significantly associated with Gulf War Syndrome. To add to this, rates of PTSD were found to be much lower in Gulf War veterans, while the vast majority of Gulf War Syndrome sufferers were not found to have a psychiatric illness. However, interestingly enough, combat stress was found to exacerbate the side effects of chemical exposure, a phenomenon that more convincingly explains the causes of Gulf War Syndrome. Chemical exposure. Throughout the short duration of the Gulf War, combatants were consistently exposed to harmful chemical substances that could come in a variety of forms. Perhaps the most easily recognizable for their smoke plumes could be seen for hundreds of kilometers were the poisonous gases that emanated from over 750 oil well fires, such as dioxin, which if inhaled in great amounts could cause skin rashes, fatigue, headaches, and insomnia. Next were pesticides employed to kill the swarms of dangerous insects that resided in the Persian Gulf and to prevent the spread of sandfly fever, a disease that affected around 60% of British and U.S. troops. Issued with sprays, creams, and liquids for use on the skin, uniforms, and bedding, as well as crates full of pest strips, 15 of these products actually contained toxins that were detrimental to human health, with the U.S. Army estimating that as many as 40,000 soldiers may have been overexposed to pesticides such as pyrethroids, which were applied to uniforms up to 30 times a month, organochlorines, a neurotoxin used to kill lice, and diethyltoluamide, more commonly known as DEET, the most frequently used insect repellent for the skin that was also known to damage plastic materials. Furthermore, in order to safeguard troops from possible chemical attacks, soldiers were obliged to carry with them packets with 21-pyridostigmine bromide pills in order to reduce the effects of exposure to nerve agents. Although the recommended dose was 30 milligrams every 8 hours for a time period of 72 hours, followed by a 24-hour break, troops often ignored it and took it constantly after widespread reports of dead sheep, goats, and camels convinced many that the Iraqi invaders were actively using chemical weapons. Numbering over 5.3 million doses, a reported 250,000 NATO personnel took PB tablets, which, if injected too frequently, can cause side effects that mirror the symptoms of Gulf War syndrome. Another hazardous substance that Gulf War servicemen and women also had to contend with was depleted uranium, which could be found in low levels in spent munitions, since it was known to increase the penetrative effectiveness of projectiles, and as a layer on heavily armored tanks because it was also prized for its protective qualities. Overall, DU-infused missiles hit a total of 21 NATO vehicles, while many troops suffered overexposure during a cleanup operation in July of 1991 after an accidental fire at Camp Doha in Kuwait destroyed many M1A1 tanks and munitions lined with depleted uranium. Lastly, low-level exposure to sarin, a nerve agent first synthesized in Germany in the 1930s, as well as mustard gas, a staple of chemical warfare created in 1822 and widely used in the First World War, have been pointed to as a possible high-risk factor for Gulf War syndrome. The appearance of these chemicals has been attributed to the bombing of Iraqi chemical plants from January 19th to the 24th of 1991, and the subsequent decision to disregard the warnings of chemical alarms on the basis that they were false and meant to cause panic among the Allies. Their emergence has also been traced to the destruction of an ammunition depot at Qamishiyah in Iraq in the aftermath of the war in March, which produced a plume later thought to contain nerve agents that were potentially inhaled by up to 95,000 personnel. What was the root cause? The cause of Gulf War syndrome was most likely the result of a combination of these toxins, and recent research has helped narrow down the candidates even further. Although many were convinced for a long time that their chronic condition was the result of irradiation, a study from 2020 from the University of Portsmouth examining the levels of depleted uranium in the bodies of patients diagnosed with Gulf War syndrome found that none had been majorly exposed to it. The mystery, however, according to some researchers, has been solved after a 2022 assessment funded by the U.S. government of over 1,000 Gulf War veterans affirmed that low-level sarin poisoning was the principal cause, with results demonstrating that those with a weaker PON1 gene, which plays an integral part in the breakdown of toxicants in the body, were found to be 9 times more likely to be diagnosed with Gulf War syndrome. Conclusion. Although the authors of the 2022 paper claim they have solved the puzzle of Gulf War syndrome, it will take further evaluations to fully confirm their findings. Nevertheless, it represents a watershed moment for those whose lives have been ruined by this debilitating disease, with treatments based on this research now being developed and likely to become available over the next few years. It's thanks to diligent scientific inquiry that veterans suffering from Gulf War syndrome will soon be able to recover that semblance of normality in their daily lives that was stolen from them by one of the most terrifying nerve gases of the modern era. The 1,000-yard stare, shell shock in World War I. The 1,000-yard stare, it can be simply defined as the unfocused gaze of someone who has seen too much. It's a characteristic of those who have experienced war and combat zones, and is most commonly associated with the victims of shell shock, or in today's terminology, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. By the time World War I came around in 1914, technology and weaponry had advanced greatly since the days of Napoleon. Battlefields were deadlier, with more varied and horrific ways of attacking and killing the enemy, leading to psychological trauma en masse in a way that really hadn't been seen before. The first recorded use of the term shell shock was by Dr. and Captain Charles S. Myers, writing a report for the paper The Lancet in February 1915. In it, he examined the cases of 3 young men he studied, 2 privates and a corporal, breaking down the symptoms they displayed. From here, a list of common but extremely varied symptoms of shell shock was defined, which included sleeplessness, anxiety, fear, harassing sights and experiences, mania, mental confusion, memory loss, hallucinations and delusions, severe psychosis, and in some cases, a complete mental breakdown or mental stupor. As well as these mental symptoms, physical symptoms were also recorded such as headaches, nausea, and dizziness, also referred to as neurasthenia. Dr. William Aldrin Turner, building off Myers' report, wrote about his findings at base hospitals in France. Dr. Turner spoke about neurasthenia and the impact of witnessing extreme war violence on an individual. He stressed the link between physical symptoms and mental issues, strongly identifying cases where mental shock led to other physiological symptoms, such as deaf mutism that continued long after it should have subsided. Although 1915 was the first recorded mention of shell shock, it's now estimated that by December 1914, 7 to 10% of all British officers and 3 to 4% of other ranks were suffering from it. In the cases of those with neurasthenia, Turner recommended rest and recovery at home, although the degree of severity of nervous shock and neurasthenia affected his recommendations. The 3 men that Myers observed had all been victims of recent nearby shell explosions, suffering from mental fog thereafter. But Turner had the benefit of observing multiple participants over a longer stretch of time, meaning he was able to draw further distinctions between differing types of shell shock, which he referred to as nervous shock. In fact, Turner may have been the first to recognize that it was not just acts of war, such as a nearby explosion or one specific traumatic incident that led to those cases of shock, but that what he referred to as general wear and tear could impact mentally over time, resulting in shell shock. Interestingly, Turner also identified that it's not just war that caused this, but specific war conditions were more likely to cause cases of shell shock than others. For example, Turner observed that the intensity of the fighting on the front lines impacted this, highlighting that more cases were seen from the severe fighting in Flanders and around Ypres than other battles. These earlier battles notably suffered from heavy artillery fire, which could go some way to explain the increase in number of shell shock cases. Regardless, shell shock was both a new and increasing epidemic during World War I, with physicians working hard to understand the new phenomenon, at the same time as dealing with countless cases of it in their front-line soldiers. While the early reports of Myers and Turner are quite positive, saying that recovery is favorable and likely for these soldiers and that time is simply needed in most cases for rest and recovery, it later became apparent this wasn't quite the case. By 1916, very few cases of shell shock had returned to fighting. At one Red Cross hospital, only 21% of discharges returned to military duty, and Gordon Holmes, the consultant neurologist to the British Expeditionary Forces, reported that the base hospitals in France, where the fighting was strongest, were seeing return rates of 30 to 40% in comparison to the UK's 4 to 5%. As cases increased, understanding almost seemed to go backward, more than likely due to the panic over realization of how many soldiers were affected in Britain. Although initially physicians like Myers and Turner advocated for hypnotherapy psychotherapy measures to help treat shell shock, over the next few years the efficacy of their methods began to be questioned. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Holmes was brought in to replace Myers, and his methods, while more in line with the British Army's desires, unfortunately did a lot to undermine recent discoveries on the impact of shell shock on its sufferers, and set in motion a string of events that led to the demonization of those dealing with the mental illness. Notably, his reporting on relapse rates was much lower than the actual figures and didn't take into account the high number of the men treated for shell shock that never returned to active warfare. Sadly, fundamentally, the general British belief became one that shell shock was down to a weakness of mind and spirit rather than anything else. It's possible this general mentality is what actually made shell shock so prominent in the British forces, with the general populace believing strongly in the mantras "stiff upper lip" and "we are British, we carry on," that led to a general subconscious abhorrence to any ailment of a mental nature. Unfortunately, things only got worse from there for those who experienced shell shock. Holmes subsequently shut Myers centers dedicated to treating the illness and reallocated them to soldiers with venereal diseases. It is he who we partly have to thank for the decades-long perception of the casualties of war, reducing shell shock to simple cowardice or feebleness of mind. While his legacy may not have been favorable to him, it is somewhat well-deserved, as his actions at the time directly led to some of the harsh treatment methods these patients experienced. For example, the most severe cases of shell shock were shipped off to mental asylums and dedicated hospitals, where treatment ranged wildly from the reasonable to the completely inhumane. The most famous or infamous example of this was the work by Dr. Louis Yealand, whose methods, even then, were seen as controversial. Yealand strongly believed in Faradism, the use of electricity in therapy, much like the electroshock therapy used until the 1980s. In his 1918 work, Historical Disorders of Warfare, he gleefully documented the treatment types he used on sufferers of shell shock, describing them as successful despite their barbarism. One of the main methods Yealand favored included applying electric shocks to the throat, neck, and limbs forcibly for horrifying long extended periods of time, sometimes berating the patient verbally while doing so. In some cases, he went so far as to also apply hot plates to the skin and put out lit cigarettes on the end of the patient's tongue. What that would do to cure shell shock may be anybody's guess, but Yealand was convinced that his methods were the right ones. The nuances and different treatments of shell shock varied dramatically across World War I, and by the end of the conflict there was still no great consensus on the illness among medical professionals. What followed was silent suffering. Soldiers unwilling or unable to discuss their shell shock, coupled with the disdain and belief of cowardice that stained those who experienced it, meant that over the next decade after the war, little progress was made in understanding shell shock or its effects. The most notable inquiry was that of the Southborough Report in 1922. But even in the paper's findings, opinions over the cause of shell shock were sharply divided among the groups of experts consulted. Rather than addressing this difficulty in defining the key causes of shell shock, the paper focused on recommendations for future affairs and largely blamed the illness on things such as a lack of training in troops in certain battles. Regardless of the justifications and investigations, the fact remains that to the British military at least, World War I shell shock sufferers were largely regarded as cowards, and in many instances were even shot for it on the front lines. Even putting aside the fact that many would balk in the face of war and certain death, these men were not cowards, but sufferers of an illness brought on by the horrendous reality they were forced to face daily. They deserve recognition and an apology for the reputation they earned because of this. But incredibly, it took until 2006 for an official pardon to be issued to those shot in the name of cowardice during World War I. And decades for sufferers of mental illness to be taken seriously. A land fit for heroes? The treatment of World War I veterans in Great Britain. They were the pride of their nation when World War I started. Masses of young Britons, many barely legally eligible to enlist, responded to the call of their country to fight the war. Many of them who were too young to fight. Boys as young as 16 or 17 years old lied about their age, as they didn't want to stay in the safety of their homes. They wanted to take part in the war and serve their country. Many didn't know the reasons why the war had started. The king called them to arms, and they were willing to serve. Such was the state of mind of the whole nation. Who else would fight if not these brave individuals? They truly were national heroes. and they were sent off to war with chants and praise. The romantic image of war changed the instant they arrived at the front line. It was nothing like they had imagined. During the next 4 years, they would give up every part of their youth to serve in makeshift trenches in a country that was not even their own. Far from their homes, they endured a savage war where violence and death were part of everyday life. Death lurked around every corner. Snipers, artillery shells, and poison gas. The gruesome deaths they saw on a daily basis would haunt them for the rest of their lives. At some point, one would stop fearing for their life because they knew that death was sure to come for them. It made no difference how or when it happened. In those 4 years of war, these young men matured beyond their years. To live and fight in such conditions left great scars on their souls and minds. Those that survived and returned home would never be the same again. But their expectation was that life would be normal once they came back to their home and family. They were wrong. Being a First World War veteran in your early 20s was a burden by itself. Returning to normal life from the experience of the muddy trenches in France was very difficult. Ex-servicemen were met with little empathy. Civilians who had spent the war in the safety of British cities and towns just couldn't comprehend what their soldiers had gone through. Families and friends couldn't understand what veterans had seen and experienced. But one thing they didn't expect was the rejection that they would face. In a situation of mass unemployment, there were no jobs for veterans. Those who left everything when their country called upon them now faced a new battle, trying to find employment. Some employers even actively avoided hiring ex-servicemen, and businesses had signs saying, "No ex-servicemen need apply." Returning to their pre-war lives with proper jobs that would allow them to feed their families was a long and difficult process. The government, pressured by the increasing number of jobless veterans, failed to respond to their demands and provide adequate pensions and employment. Veterans felt resentment towards their government. In response to this, organizations were formed to help them find their way back to civilian life. In 1921, the 4 largest veterans organizations united into the British Legion. Service, not self, was their motto. It was much more difficult for disabled veterans. Almost 1 million British soldiers died in the Great War, but twice as many came home with some level of disability. Of these veterans, 750,000 were permanently disabled and 40,000 were amputees. Some soldiers came home without both their legs or arms, or were blind, deaf, with their faces disfigured, or their lungs were destroyed by poison gas. Thousands suffered from shell shock, a psychological condition known today as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Unlike their comrades who were jobless but able to work, disabled veterans were denied the possibility to return to the jobs they had when they left to join the war. Their attention, therefore, turned to the government, the same one that sent them to the battlefields where they had lost their limbs. As heroes, they deserved care and comfort, but all hope was futile. The government did provide disability pensions for all veterans depending on the level of their disability, but this was far from enough to have a decent living, far from what they would have had with a proper job. The government claimed that they could do nothing more in their responsibility for disabled servicemen. The whole effort of finding jobs for them and their reintegration into society was transferred to patriotic well-doers. In such a situation, a number of movements, organizations, and individuals put together courses and training programs for veterans to learn new skills that could help them find new jobs. They organized charities, helped ex-servicemen in every possible manner, and showed them that they were people who appreciated their sacrifice. It wasn't easy for battle-hardened veterans to live on charity, but the government left them no choice. Of all the major belligerent European states, only Great Britain relied on voluntary efforts to employ disabled ex-servicemen. At the time, an image of a limbless veteran begging on the streets was a common sight, not just in Great Britain, but across Europe. Soldiers who fought against each other in the war shared the same fate. However, only in Great Britain were unsatisfied veterans restrained from turning their anger into violence. In Germany, where they also had a large population of disabled veterans, riots and uprisings were frequent occurrences. In France, veterans organizations were often involved in various political pressures on the government and therefore had a greater impact on the state's policy towards them. British veterans of the First World War had trusted their nation when the war had started in 1914. But after 1918, it seemed like the promise of a land fit for heroes was not a reality.